You become, in the language of the internet age, an influencer, a real one, a person with genuine power to shape what other people believe and how they live and what choices they make about their own health and their own bodies. And then a journalist starts asking questions, and the whole thing falls apart. Because Belle Gibson never had cancer. Not brain cancer. Not blood cancer. Not the cancer in her spleen, her uterus, her liver, and her kidneys that she had described in loving, detailed, emotionally devastating posts to her followers over the course of several years. Not any cancer. Not ever. The entire foundation of her empire, the survival story that had made her famous, that had given her credibility, that had made hundreds of thousands of people trust her with some of the most important decisions of their lives, with a lie she had constructed from nothing and maintained for years with a precision and a commitment that investigators, journalists, and psychologists who studied the case would later describe as one of the most extraordinary frauds the internet had ever produced. She was never going to die. She never beat anything. There was nothing to beat. There was only a story and a young woman who had decided to tell it, and a world that wanted desperately to believe it was true. The details multiplied over time. She said the cancer had spread to her blood, her spleen, her uterus, her liver. She said she had suffered a stroke. She said she had undergone multiple heart surgeries. She posted updates about her health journey with a kind of intimacy and vulnerability that social media rewards, inviting her followers into a version of her life that was constructed with great care to produce maximum emotional impact. She photographed her food. She shared her recipes. She documented her wellness routines with a consistency and visual polish that marks a person who understands exactly what they are building. The Whole Pantry app launched in 2013 and was downloaded 200,000 times in its first month. Apple featured it as one of the best new apps of the year. A major publisher, Penguin, offered a book deal. The cookbook was published in Australia in late 2014 and was scheduled for international release, including in the United States and the United Kingdom, in 2015. She was signed to speak at wellness events. She was profiled by major media outlets. She was, by every external measure, a success story of the most inspirational kind. A sick young woman who had refused to give up, who had found her own path, who had turned her suffering into a platform that helped other people. She also told her followers she was donating the proceeds of her work to charity, specifically to a range of causes, including organizations supporting children with cancer and communities in need. She named the charities publicly. She tied the purchases people made from her platform, the app downloads, the cookbook sales, the event tickets to specific charitable outcomes. Buy this and you are helping a sick child. Download this and you are contributing to something that matters. The commercial and the charitable were woven together in a way that made spending money on Belle Gibson's products feel like an act of generosity. This is the complete story of Belle Gibson. And once you understand all of it, from the first Instagram post to the unpaid fine that Australian authorities are still chasing a decade later, you will understand something important not just about one woman's con, but about the world that made it possible. A world where a compelling story and a pretty photograph can reach more people than any doctor, any scientist, or any regulator. A world where the wellness industry is worth hundreds of billions of dollars and operates almost entirely on trust. In a world where, when that trust is abused in the most cynical way imaginable, the consequences for the person who abused it can be, somehow remarkably small. Annabelle Natalie Gibson was born in October 1991 in Western Australia. Her childhood, by her own accounts, was not easy. She described a difficult family situation, a mother with mental health challenges, a childhood that had not provided the stability and safety that children need. Those early accounts of her background would later become difficult to separate from the broader pattern of her life, in which the boundary between what was true and what was constructed for effect was almost impossible to locate. What is known is that she left school at 14, became a single mother in her late teens, and found herself in her early 20s navigating the pressures of young parenthood without significant financial resources or social support. At some point around 2009, she began telling people she had been diagnosed with a heart condition. The story evolved. The heart condition became something more serious. The something more serious became, by the time she began building her public profile around 2012 and 2013, a diagnosis of terminal brain cancer. She said she had been given 4 months to live. She said the cancer had been caused by a vaccination against the HPV virus, the Gardasil vaccine, a claim it had no medical basis, and that would later contribute to her story being used as a reference point in discussions about vaccine misinformation. She said she had refused conventional treatment, chosen a path of clean eating, natural medicine, and positive thinking, and that this choice had saved her life. Imagine you have just been told you have terminal brain cancer. You are in your early 20s. You have a young child. The doctors have given you a timeline that no human being should ever have to hear. And then somehow, against every medical probability, you survive. Not through chemotherapy. Not through radiation. Not through the arsenal of treatments that conventional medicine would have offered you. Through food. Through clean living. Through a radical decision to reject everything the medical establishment told you and trust your body, your instincts, and your belief that the natural world had answers that hospitals did not. You share your story online. People find it. They are moved by it. They are inspired by it. Some of them are sitting in waiting rooms themselves, holding diagnoses of their own, terrified and desperate for any reason to believe that things might be different from what they have been told. And here is this young woman, this warm and beautiful and seemingly ordinary person, telling them that she survived, that there is another way, that the body can heal if you give it what it needs. You build an app. You write a cookbook. You grow a following of hundreds of thousands of people. Apple features your app as one of the best in the world. A major publisher offers you a book deal. You are interviewed by some of the biggest media outlets in Australia. You raise money for charities. You tell people you are donating the proceeds to children with cancer, to families in need, to causes that matter. There was a man in Queensland named Carl Ainscough whose wife and daughter had both died of cancer. His daughter had been a wellness influencer herself. His family's story had been touched by the world that Belle Gibson inhabited. When the Netflix dramatization of Gibson's story aired in 2025 and appeared to include characters that paralleled elements of his family's experience, he spoke publicly about what it meant to see his family's devastation turn into content. He said that behind the television stories and the dramatization were real people whose lives had been destroyed. He said it clearly, and he said it without drama. Real people. Real lives. Devastated by the actions of this individual. He was not wrong. Because while Belle Gibson was building her brand, real people with real cancer diagnoses were reading her posts. Some of them were making decisions based on what she told them. She had said publicly, in social media posts that were later screenshot and preserved and quoted in court documents and investigative reports, that she had helped countless people choose natural therapy over conventional treatment. That she had guided people away from chemotherapy, away from radiation, away from the treatments that oncologists recommend because decades of clinical evidence support them, towards smoothies and clean eating and positive thinking and the belief that the body can heal itself if you simply trust it enough. People with cancer who delay or refuse conventional treatment because they believe there is a better way sometimes die who might otherwise have lived. That is not a statistical abstraction. It is a medical reality. And Belle Gibson knew, or should have known, that the story she was telling her followers was one that could push people in that direction. She told it anyway. By early 2015, journalists at 2 Australian publications had been separately investigating inconsistencies in her story. The charities she had named publicly as beneficiaries of her fundraising had begun to raise concerns. Some of them said they had received nothing. Others said the amounts they had received were a fraction of what had been publicly claimed. Australian journalist Richard Gilliatt at The Australian was the first to publish, in March 2015, a piece that laid out the charity discrepancy in direct, documented terms. The money Belle Gibson said she was donating had largely not been donated. The response from Gibson was initially to blame administrative errors, timing issues, the complexity of running a growing business. But the investigation was already moving beyond the charity question to something more fundamental. And in April 2015, in an interview with the Australian Women's Weekly, Belle Gibson said something that her followers, her publisher, her business partners, and the media world that had celebrated her had not been prepared for. She admitted she had never been diagnosed with cancer. Not that the cancer had been misidentified. Not that the diagnosis had been wrong in a technical medical sense. She admitted that the story she had told, the story that was the entire foundation of her brand, her credibility, her platform, and her influence, was not true. She had not had brain cancer. She had not cured herself through clean eating. She had not survived anything. There was no miracle. There was no inspiring journey. There was a fabrication constructed and maintained over years that had generated a following of hundreds of thousands of people, a successful app, a published cookbook, a significant income, and a speaking career. The response was immediate and global. Her publisher canceled the international release of the cookbook. Penguin moved to distance itself from the project. The app was quietly withdrawn. Media outlets that had celebrated her story were forced into the uncomfortable position of examining how they had accepted it so completely. The wellness industry, which had embraced her as one of its most compelling figures, tried to create space between itself and the scandal. Consumer Affairs Victoria, the Australian government agency responsible for consumer protection, began a formal investigation. The investigation took 2 years. In 2017, the Federal Court of Australia found that Gibson had violated Australian consumer law through misleading and deceptive conduct. The court accepted that the charity donation claims had been false. A judge ordered Gibson to pay a fine of 410,000 Australian dollars. She did not pay it. She did not appear at her hearings. When she eventually appeared in court in 2019, she said she could not afford to pay. Forensic accountants who examined her finances found that in the 2 years preceding that statement, she had spent $91,000 on gambling, cryptocurrency, and clothing. Her partner at the time was paying most of her living expenses. The court found her evidence of financial hardship unconvincing, but the mechanisms for enforcing the debt against a private individual in Australia proved difficult to deploy effectively. In January 2020, the Sheriff's Office of Victoria executed a search warrant at her home and seized items to begin recovering the unpaid fine. A second warrant followed in May 2021. As of March 2025, a decade after she admitted to lying about her cancer, Belle Gibson has not paid the fine. With interest and costs, it has grown to exceed $500,000 Australian dollars. Consumer Affairs Victoria confirmed in a statement in 2025 that it was still actively pursuing the debt. She was never criminally charged. That detail is the one that most people who encounter this story find hardest to accept. The woman who built an entire commercial empire on a fabricated cancer diagnosis, who publicly claimed to be helping others reject conventional medical treatment, who took money from followers under false pretenses and failed to donate to the charity she named, faced no criminal consequence. A civil fine that she did not pay. That is the full legal accounting. During the years after the scandal broke, new dimensions of Gibson's story continued to surface that made it increasingly difficult to place her behavior into any single explanatory framework. In January 2020, a video emerged in which Gibson appeared wearing a headscarf and speaking in fragments of the Oromo language, presenting herself to an Ethiopian interviewer as a member of the Ethiopian community in Melbourne who had been informally adopted after years of volunteer work and who referred to Ethiopia as back home. None of this appeared to be true in any verifiable sense. It was another constructed identity layered on top of or replacing the previous one, in a pattern that observers and psychologists who studied the case described as consistent with a person whose relationship with truth and identity was not conventional. A clinical professor of psychiatry, who had coined the term Munchausen's by internet, a phenomenon describing people who fabricate illness online to gain attention and sympathy, described Gibson's behavior as particularly predatory and as deceit on a grand scale for personal profit. But the court that assessed her case accepted that there was insufficient evidence to prove she had not been acting out of delusion, that she may have come to believe elements of her own story in ways that complicated a straightforward fraud analysis. No official psychological diagnosis was ever made public. What is public is the impact. Australia rewrote its laws governing therapeutic health claims in 2022, significantly tightening the rules around what wellness influencers can say and what endorsements people with claimed health expertise can make. Changes that regulators and legal analysts have explicitly connected in part to the fallout from the Gibson case. Her story changed the regulatory landscape of an entire country's wellness industry. She herself faces no consequence from those new rules because by the time they passed, she had no public platform left to operate on. The Netflix drama Apple Cider Vinegar, starring Caitlin Dever, premiered in February 2025 and introduced the story to a new global audience. The companion documentary The Search for Instagram's Worst Con Artist launched simultaneously on Netflix and featured interviews with Gibson's brother, her stepfather, and the journalist who had investigated her. The combined effect was a massive resurgence of public interest and public anger from people who were encountering the story for the first time and finding the lack of criminal consequence almost impossible to process. The anger is not irrational. It connects to something real about what the internet has made possible and what accountability in the age of social media actually looks like. Belle Gibson reached hundreds of thousands of people with a story that was entirely false. She reached them with intimacy and warmth and the specific emotional vocabulary of the wellness world, a vocabulary designed to lower defenses and build trust. She built that trust methodically. She leveraged it commercially. She directed some of the people she reached away from treatments that might have saved their lives and toward a lifestyle that could not do what she claimed. And when the lie collapsed, she received a civil fine she did not pay and went on with her life while the world rewrote laws in her name. There are people today who make their living on social media telling stories about their health journeys, their cancer survivals, their miraculous recoveries. Most of them are telling the truth. Some of them are not. The tools available to distinguish between those two groups are almost entirely dependent on the willingness of individuals to question what they are reading, on the vigilance of journalists willing to investigate, and on regulatory frameworks that are perpetually catching up with the pace of online culture. Belle Gibson moved faster than all of those systems for years. And by the time they caught up, the damage was done and the fine was unpaid, and the woman herself had simply constructed a new identity and moved on. The journalist Richard Gilliatt, who was the first to report what she had done, said in 2025 that the thing remains an open wound, that what she suffered was incredible public humiliation, that there is a part of him that thinks people are going to have to let it go at some point. But letting go is easier when there has been an accounting, when the harm has been acknowledged, when the person who caused it has stood somewhere and said clearly and completely what they did and who they did it to and why. That has never happened. Not in any courtroom. Not in any public statement from Gibson that has ever been accepted as complete or honest. Not in a way that closed the wound rather than simply stopping the bleeding. The fine is still unpaid. The people who made medical decisions based on her story are still living with whatever consequences those decisions produced. And the internet is still full of wellness influencers telling stories about their health journeys to audiences who want to believe that extraordinary things are possible when you eat clean and think positive and trust your body over the medical establishment. Some of those stories are true, and some of them are exactly what Belle Gibson's story was. Product. A very well-crafted, very carefully maintained, very profitable product, with nothing underneath it at all. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you land on this case. Do you think the lack of criminal charges was justice? Do you think what she did should have been treated as a crime? Because this is one of those stories where the answer says something about what we think the internet owes us and what we owe each other when we put our stories into it. Subscribe right now so you never miss a story like this one. Because there are more of them out there, and some of them have not been caught yet.